Overfishing is a complex problem to solve. It's not something that we can solve overnight. Obviously, if we would have been able to, we would have done it by now. But there are a lot of layers within fisheries. There's the science portion, there's the advocacy portion, there's the activism portion, there's the fishing community portion, there's the recreational versus commercial, and even within the commercial, there's the artisanal versus industrialized. There are a lot of different layers within fisheries that make it really complex to solve. On top of that, there are laws that govern the way we manage everything in the ocean. Not necessarily the high seas, but that is coming. But there are laws within everybody's exclusive economic zone that could differ depending on the country or state, that could differ depending on where they are in the world. And it could differ in the approach that they have to marine fisheries. And that's a lot to take in. And so it can be confusing to find out where these laws are going and how to work through these laws and how to make them better. And so I invited Eva van Heukelom to the podcast to be able to discuss this. She is a legal professional passionate about making the seafood sector more responsible. She started an advisory firm called Natural Justice to support the sector with more diligent consideration of national and international law and policy in impacting seafood sustainably. We're going to talk to Eva about law and fisheries on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the law and fisheries. Law of the sea and law of the fish. We're going to be talking to Eva van Heukelom, who is someone who decided when she went to law school to choose governing fish instead of going to corporate law or going to criminal law as many others do. She decided to forego maybe the big bucks and to live a life of impact by looking after fisheries around the world and working with different governments, working with different organizations, working with different private ventures and companies to be able to discuss and be able to manage policy and law of fisheries internationally. And I think that is something that we don't really get to discuss on this. Fun to be able to have someone with Eva's background and experience to come on the podcast and kind of take us through the law of the sea and the law of the fish, to be able to what is law for fisheries and how is it managed? How can we make it better? What are the trends that we see? We go through all that in this interview with Eva. So here is the interview with Eva van Heukelom from Natural Justice. Enjoy, and I'll talk to you after. Hey Eva, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about fisheries and the law?
Always. Appreciate the invite.
Love it. I love it. I'm super excited because it's not all every day that we get a professional law person here, a law professional, especially around sustainability and the sea and around seafood, around fisheries. I'm very excited to dive deep into what the laws are around and what's happened in the past, what was good, what was bad, and kind of get into the trends of what's happening now and what's needed in the future. I think there's a lot of things that we can discuss today, that we're going to discuss today, that people don't realize what happens in fisheries, that kind of gets hidden. It's not over like the talk of the town around fisheries a lot of times when we talk about people just learning more about fisheries. We always hear about fishing communities, fishermen, fisherwomen who are out there, some people say, oh, everything's overfished. Some fisheries are sustainable. There are groups that are out there that try and keep it sustainable, and transparency is key. So we're going to get into all of that stuff. But before we do, Eva, why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks. And you're right. It is sometimes rather niche field to work in. I must say My fellow law students were definitely surprised when I said I was specializing in fish.
Yeah.
Since most of them went into corporate law, contract law, and all that stuff. But yeah, so my name is Eva van Heukelom, originally from the Netherlands, and I own Natural Justice, which is a small consultancy, and I work with clients globally, and I specialize in really the intersection of law and fisheries. Okay. So I started about 8 years ago with this specialty, and when I started, you go to the usual suspects in terms of what law is relevant for fisheries. So I really started with law of the sea, fisheries law, trade law, environmental law. But now increasingly, I'm also looking more at some overlooked areas of law that I believe are really impacting our efforts to make fisheries more responsible, more equitable. and linking this to the obligations that states have under international law of the sea and environmental law, etc. So yeah, I'd be very happy to expand on that a little bit, and yeah, really with that type of work, hoping to bring more focus on the role of states and fisheries management and the role of law in that, as well as some more nuance sometimes where I feel like a lot of discussions around states is very much, oh, they're unwilling, they don't want to collaborate with this, they're not doing enough there. And I really just don't think it's that black and white. It's a very gray area, and there's a lot to explore there. So yeah, I do a lot of research in that intersection really of the fisheries sector practically, and then the laws that impact it.
I love it. I love it. I think that's wonderful. I can't wait to get into all of this. What, you talked a little bit at the beginning, your classmates in law school were a little surprised when you decided to pick fish as something to focus on, as your niche to focus on. Like we know lawyers get paid a lot of money when they go into corporate, they go into criminal law or whatever. And you see shows like Suits and things like that all over the world. You see these types of shows that come up because people are interested in the way lawyers speak and the way they do business. And it's always like high end stuff, and they charge a lot for their hourly rate and all this kind of stuff. You decided to choose fish. You decided to choose in a sort of environmental law, but even more niche down from environmental law. What made you decide to follow that route in law school? Knowing that, environmental law, maybe you don't get paid as much as corporate law. No, we don't have to get into finances, but it's definitely a very different way of doing things. So just love to know your rationale behind following that path. I love it, but I'd love to know your rationale.
Yeah, certainly. And there's, I think, 2 stories I can tell you to illustrate that a little bit.
Love it.
So there's one that I tell a bit more often, but a little bit of background is I wanted to study law. I was about 12 years old when I decided I wanted to go to law school, because I feel the law is really just the most tangible thing we have to protect people, to protect the planet. And you get confronted at a young age, you realize the world is not a fair place. It's people need to be protected, and I've always seen the law as a way to make impact. So that's always been a very important motivator for me. And then I was initially really focused on working in areas that just came out of conflict or with refugees. And so that's one story, is that I actually went ahead and did this work. So I was living in Beirut and working in a very challenging area of the city there, and I was trying to do my part and supporting people that just came out of conflict, and doing my work with humanitarian law, refugee law. And I realized I'm just not cut out for it. It's too damn hard. Like, it's really, I was like, I'm gonna either get used to this, which is not a good option, or I'm gonna cry myself to sleep every night. So one thing is kind of losing my career path that I was on. And then another thing is I took a big sailing trip. So I had this crazy plan to make it from Amsterdam to Australia without catching a flight. And at some point, you have to jump on a boat, right? So I did this in Malaysia. I found an Australian guy. He needed to bring back a sailing boat. And so I ended up sailing through Indonesia with him for 2 months. Wow. And we had like a lure out in the back, and all it was catching was plastic. And so that tells me, okay, there's an issue with plastic here, but more than that, it's where's all the fish? And we tried to buy fish off of fishermen. We saw fishermen that were just out there in boats for days, not enough food, not enough water. And it was very confrontational and really made me realize that our oceans are not doing well. And this is not just bad news for the oceans themselves, but you could see it's impacting people, and these people often didn't really have an alternative. What do you do if you live in a tiny island, right? And if there's no fish to catch, how are you going to feed your children? How are you going to create any livelihood? So that was, I think, really for me the main push, where when I went back to law school to do my master's, before I knew it, every essay I was writing was about fisheries sector, whether it was the environmental law subjects where it made sense, but I did the same for trade law, I did the same for investment law, did the same for European law. I could always find an angle. It just, there was no way back really at that point, I think.
And every time you did those assignments, every time you focused on a paper on fisheries, whether it be through trade, whether it be through access or whatever that might be, what was your feeling every time you finished one? Because I know sometimes, you know, as a student, you follow a certain path and say you do a paper on something and it may not be the best interest, you know, and so you may not be like, when you hand in, you're like, okay, I'm done with that kind of subject. But obviously this is something that was continued your passion for it. So every time you hand in one of those papers, what was your feeling on that? Like, were there more questions that came from what you found and be like, I could research this more? Or was it just like, okay, maybe this is not, like, trade is not where I want to go. Maybe it's somewhere else. Like, what was that avenue? Like, what was that feeling?
Yeah, so I deliberately made a combination between, you know, like growing up in Europe, like it's almost impossible to go into a supermarket and not violate a human right one way or another. Like it's really sad. We all know that
Right.
food industries are just not in a great shape.
Right.
And I knew this about chocolate, I knew this about coffee, and then I was learning more about that in the context of fisheries. And so I deliberately made that combination of the economic side, so trade and investment on one hand, and then the human rights law, environmental law, really more the aspirational, like where you'd like the sector to be on the other hand. And so, yeah, I really wrote about where those different areas came together. And for instance, what I learned there, I think it's the topics I focused on there weren't necessarily exactly the topics I'm focusing on now, because I know a lot more now about what impacts the sector and what doesn't than I did back then. And I really just had to invent it myself. Obviously, none of my law professors knew much about fish. And and I don't blame them. And but I did catch on pretty early on that it is as unfair as a lot of the other food sectors. And for instance, particularly that whatever the EU is doing on paper looks great.
Yeah.
But then if you put it more in the context of certain impacts, then you really start to question about, I guess, the hypocrisy of a lot of these systems and how the states work together on this. And yeah, like an example of an essay I wrote that I later published was on the Western Sahara, because I was watching a documentary. So that's an area occupied by Morocco. And in international law, peoples have a right to what we call self-determination. And under that right, you have the right to benefit from your own natural resources. But so a lot of the fish that's caught in front of the coast of the Western Sahara, it is not benefiting the people from the Western Sahara. It was actually benefiting either the EU or Morocco itself, because they were the ones fishing there. And so I think that was a very interesting example of where you have, you know, two formal states, an occupation, a natural resource, and the EU has all these trade and all these fisheries agreements with Morocco, where it's like, well, you, on the one hand, you're promoting the right to self-determination, but on the other hand, you have these economic treaties that are making it extremely difficult to really implement that right to self-determination in practice. So I thought that was a very interesting example of, I guess, just politics being politics. But if you really look at it legally, it's not legal. It's not in line with what's been agreed upon internationally. So it did really seem like a sector where a lot of those international challenges exist, and where there is just a lot of unfairness, and where there is a lot of work to be done to fight for people that are in more vulnerable positions to benefit from these marine resources, as is their right to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's there are a lot of laws out there, and a lot of them are there to protect people. A lot of them are there to allow people to fish sustainably. And there are a lot of laws that are out there that are supposed to prevent from overfishing, from exploitation, overexploitation. A lot of the laws to protect human rights. There are a lot of laws that aren't followed in the high seas. And before we get into that, you know, you talked about the EU and setting precedents, because the EU has some pretty good policies when it comes to setting them
as well. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's
but
great on one hand and not so great on the other hand. I guess it
for
depends
sure.
on who you ask.
Yeah, that's true. That's so true.
Yeah.
But is there a difference between are the laws for land and I guess more agriculture, farming and so forth, as strict as the laws at sea? As are there, like you said, there's some similarities in certain ways in terms that they set the policies, but are there differences between land and sea when you look at the strictness of it in terms of ensuring sustainability, ensuring proper ethics when it comes to fisheries and so forth?
Short answer would be yes. I
Okay.
definitely think the laws on land are much more strict.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think that also comes from, I think with a lot of fisheries, it requires collaboration between different
Yes.
states, and that happens in the RFMOs, for instance,
Yes.
where whatever you do on your own land, you do on your own land. So in that
Yes.
sense, I would say agriculture and aquaculture is very comparable if you look at
Mm-hmm.
the laws, and sometimes it's even tackled in one single regulation, where
Yeah.
there'll just be
Makes
like
sense.
minor differences that they put in an annex or something.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of similarity there. But when you are talking about fisheries, you're really talking more about natural resource law. It's more comparable to hunting, they always say, with fisheries, right?
Gotcha.
So it's really, where aquaculture looks a lot at the inputs and the impact on the groundwater and all those things. I think with fisheries, it is really much more on how and how much you are allowed to take. But the fact that it is something that just requires international collaboration, I think that makes it a lot more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's not just the law, there's also the matter of enforcement. And it happens out at sea with fisheries, still you can put 50 legal scholars in one room, but there will still not be one conclusive answer on which jurisdictions should be involved with enforcing a certain illicit activity at sea, for instance. There's
Yeah.
pretty much always claims of, multiple claims of jurisdiction, and there's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily always a hierarchy in that.
Right.
And there are always certain flag states, sometimes port states, that refuse to do their part.
Mm-hmm.
So that really makes it challenging in practice. So it's not so much about the law per se. It is really also about why fisheries is just such a different resource than
Mm-hmm.
other food systems, and the international collaboration that it requires to properly enforce it. And also the fact it's much more expensive to send a drone or a vessel than an inspector that goes to a farm. So
Yeah.
there's also the issue of capacity, where, as I said in the beginning, I don't believe it's always an unwillingness. I think it can really be just a lack of capacity.
Yeah.
But it's also politics. If you are, let's say you're a coastal state and there's a vessel in your economic exclusive zone, where you really are the primary state to enforce the proper management of your resources there. And that state, the flag state, is a country that happens to also be giving you a lot of development aid.
Mm.
What are you going to do? I mean, your law might say one thing, but the Ministry of Fisheries doesn't operate in silo. It's going to be really challenging because they still operate in reality. So the
Right.
law is, I think, can be a great tool, but sometimes the law only goes so far.
You're right. That's very, very true. And what I want to do now is I want to start just at the basics in terms of the way the laws have been in the past and in our currently, and how they've changed to our current system. Like, start with the basics and we'll start to grow on that and build build on that. The first thing I want to do, just to clarify too, because a lot of the people that listen to this podcast are from the US. You've mentioned a couple of times when you talk about individual sort of management units, but also I think individual countries, you mentioned them as states. Can you just clarify what you mean by states when you mean that? Because some of my American viewers might be like, oh, the states, what do you mean? The states are in Europe? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, sure.
Some of them may think it is. Who knows? You never know. But what do you mean by states when you say states? I think that's a very big law term in term when it comes to a lot of policies, even internationally.
As I've at some point during my work in the fisheries sector, because I wasn't always so particularly focused on fisheries law, I did started calling them countries.
Right.
But nowadays I always talk about states and jurisdictions,
yes.
Which are basically the same often. But the thing with a state, and we even capitalize this as lawyers, like that's how much we love that word, and we basically just mean a country, and you would only say that for a UN member country, so for a recognized country.
Gotcha.
And jurisdiction in that sense is sometimes a little bit more general, where you can also say that about countries that do about jurisdictions that do govern their fisheries management, but that aren't necessarily a recognized UN states.
Gotcha.
But
okay.
I basically mean a country, and a country is the primary responsibility for that fisheries management. Yeah. So they're the ones that have the complete legal system that is supposed to manage that.
Okay. And a lot of times, from my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the countries, well, every country that has a border on the ocean, that has a coast on the ocean, has an exclusive economic zone. It's pretty much 200 nautical miles off of their shore. When you talk about jurisdiction from a national point of view, you talk about that 200 nautical mile. Within that 200 nautical mile, within the country boundaries that have been set, by the UN, internationally agreed upon, the countries, or the states, I should mention, have jurisdiction over those waters in how they are managed. They pretty much can do not whatever they want, but pretty much it's up to them. It's up to their people to say whatever they want. So as an example, a very popular case is when the Japanese were, going into the Southern Ocean, hunting whales. We know the fiasco that encountered from that with, sea shepherds, and like, you can't do this in international waters. And, the whole thing with the International Whaling Commission, goes back and forth for decades. And then finally the Japanese say, you know what, enough of this hassle. We're going back into our own waters, and we're just going to hunt, marine mammals within our own waters. Not much internationally people can do in that respect, other than maybe boycott some of their products if they really want to do so. But there's really not much they can do from a legal standpoint, because they're within their own rights within the 200 nautical miles. That kind of goes in terms of like what countries can do within the law. And this is my understanding of the law. I don't know what the specifics of marine mammal law within the Japanese 200 nautical miles, but this is some of the stories that I've seen. But so a lot of those laws now, when it comes to like North America, you have Canada, you have the US, you have Mexico. They have their treaties, and they have their North American Free Trade Agreement and stuff. And sometimes fisheries comes into that, and they work fairly well together as of until recently, fairly well together, across the borders. When it comes to the EU is managed as, the member states of the EU. How does that work for countries that have coastal borders onto the Atlantic Ocean or even the Mediterranean? Do they have the same 200 nautical miles off the coast? And do they manage, does Portugal just manage Portuguese waters, France, French waters, Germany, those types of states? Do they just manage their own waters 200 nautical miles off? Or are there other agreements where those are managed as the EU?
So it's an interesting question. First, I wanted to mention it's not like in your own EEZ you can do whatever you want. Okay. Because in the case of whaling, for instance, there is such a thing as the as a treaty on whaling. I forget the formal name, but that's from 1946. It's actually the first international law of the sea treaty that we had. So there are certain areas in which you can't just do whatever you want because, hey, it's my EEZ, so it's my jurisdiction.
Good to
but
know.
Of course, it's so much harder to enforce because there's not any other countries that that have any jurisdiction. So in international law, there is this principle, which I don't know if it's ever really been, I guess it's been relied on for things like a UN peace mission, with like the blue helmets, where it's like none of the states necessarily had any jurisdiction, but it was seen as such an issue of international importance that, but then we're talking much more about diplomacy than law per se. But just a minor correction there when it comes to the determination of your economic exclusive zone, we are indeed talking about 200 nautical miles from the coast. But and in some cases, if you're lucky, that just means there's, like in a lot of islands, for instance, that just means there's a beautiful circle around your country and you can use that. But in many instances, it will clash with someone else's EEZ. So then the general rule would be that it's somewhere in the middle, but it can deviate. That's really up to the two countries to decide. And generally, there won't be any issues there unless maybe there's any oil or any resources found, like exactly between those two. Then that's when the trouble
gets a little contentious.
Yeah, exactly. But there's even been good examples of that where countries have come to good agreements and really using the natural resources to benefit both countries. So the European Union specifically, it will then basically depend on the country and where they're located, how big their EEZ is. So the Netherlands, for instance, will clash with the UK at some point. So that's a really important collaborative partner for the Netherlands to have in some countries in Europe still have islands. So you have because it's Europe, so at least in Western Europe, all former colonial powers, and some of these islands were never really transferred back, so they're still part of the European Union area. So an example would be, well, you have the Azores in Portugal, which is, you'd have then the EEZ of Portugal, then a bit of nothing, and then again the EEZ of Portugal around the Azores Islands. But you also have French Guiana in Latin America, which is officially an overseas European territory, even though it's in Latin America. There's also some islands in the Caribbean. And in Europe, there's certain areas where European countries have given their power to the European Union, meaning that it's not the individual countries that dictate the rules there, it's at the European Union level. And fisheries, for instance, as well as trade, is an example of that. So in Europe, you have something called the Common Fisheries Policy, and that is the same for any of the EU member states. And it will also apply to French Guiana, for instance. And I have heard challenges sometimes with managing that because, their border countries are not part of the EU. And, but whenever there needs to be any sort of international collaboration, they would need to call in France because officially that's part of it. But France is like so far from this country, it's not really at the top of their priorities. So it's really quite a complicated system with the EU sometimes bringing in all the different EEZs that are technically managed under the Common Fisheries Policy.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so now we got that settled, and settled, I quote unquote settled. Let's talk about sort of the laws right now overall, like, worldwide. Obviously, they're very different in different parts of the world. But let's talk about up to now. It used to be where you could just fish wherever you want, whenever you want. Way back, a couple 100 years ago, you could do that. There weren't as many fishing fleets, weren't as efficient in catching. There's talk about times where you used to just throw a bucket in the North Atlantic and you'd be able to catch cod. It'd fill it up within minutes, if not seconds. That's obviously changed from now on. And from the 90s on, especially with the North Atlantic and the cod. where are we right now with fisheries laws? Like, if you look at fisheries laws from your perspective overall worldwide, would you say they are adequate, they are good, or they just, in some cases, they just suck?
It's a very challenging question. It's a very interesting question, but and it is something I'm researching. But considering that, for a lot of these fisheries laws or policies, I will be looking at it from an outsider perspective. So I do need to be aware of, I guess, my Eurocentric views
Yes,
before passing any judgment.
of course.
I know that it can be very hard to predict sometimes, and I think there's a lot of assumptions sometimes around the global south doing a worse job at this, and I definitely have not found that to be true.
Right.
I think I don't necessarily focus so much on evaluating whether a fisheries law is adequate, yes or no, simply because it's just really, like I said, I think to really fully understand the law, it's also just the legal context and kind of the culture. Like, for instance, if you look at fisheries transparency, there will be, in some countries, it's absolutely not a problem to be super transparent about whatever is going on in your, the allocation of fisheries authorizations, catch data, all these different fisheries data elements. There's absolutely no problem because these are countries that generally have a very long-standing legal tradition of transparency where they view natural resources as a common good and the people have a right to know that, which great. But there's a lot of countries that don't necessarily have this tradition, and kind of forcing that same approach on them is just not going to work, and it's going to make people maybe very uncomfortable. And so I think I wouldn't be able to speak intelligently to what are the good fisheries policies, and the world is a big place. It's also not my intent necessarily to pass judgment on individual fisheries policies or legislation. What I'm more interested in is having, on a global level with the seafood sector, where there's a lot of NGOs, having them focus more on the roles that states have, whether they're doing a good job now or not, but to really focus on keeping states accountable, because they do have responsibility to properly manage their fisheries resources under the international law of the sea. So there is that obligation, and I would really like to see that the sector and the different NGOs working in that sector focus much more on that. And because whether they're already doing a good job or not so much, or maybe they just don't know where to start, I think a lot of focus should go on building that capacity and creating more awareness on what is going on there, why is it failing, and also being a little bit more tangible about that, and not just like a state is doing a bad job and their fisheries management system is inadequate, but more like really tangibly think about what are systems that certain legislation can keep in place that are really enabling for this type of illicit activity to take place. And for an example could be, for instance, okay, how does a country capture information around the ultimate beneficial owner of a vessel, and how does it share that information with stakeholders? If the state doesn't have enough capacity, how is it relying on other, could be public international institutions or NGOs to increase that capacity? And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in focusing on what states are doing. But I'd like to approach that not so much from let's categorize it and say this is good, bad, worst, but more from, okay, what should be done, what is important, what are the risks, what should be considered for these systems, and focus a lot more on pushing states to do the right thing there.
That's an interesting concept, right? Is to understand what's happening, what's the risks. there are so many states. It's really difficult to try and blanket legislation for the world. Obviously, the question I asked before was a little loaded because it was like, hey, how's all the fishing legislation around the world working? Obviously, there's very different cultures, different places around the world. Everything is so unique. When we look at specific legislation, and I assume that's what you're doing, and you're going to talk about for your consultancy
all day, any day,
all day and any day, and to look at specific legislation and to analyze that and say here's the good part of the legislation, what's working, here's what's not working, and then to push that state to repair or to build a stronger legislation to help not only the fishing community but also the seafood sector within that state. That is complex in itself to be able to do that, because some states may not be willing to make those changes. When you do an analysis on a policy like that, or on a piece of legislation, what's your approach when you start to look at that, understanding that some states may not want to change too much, because we know humans, we don't like change, right?
Yes. No. And it's, like I said, it's also very political, and it's not just a bunch of rules, right? And but what I love and what I have very particularly chosen is to be in the role of a researcher and an advisor. I am not necessarily pushing an agenda. Sure, like I said, I'm pushing for attention more on certain elements, and but not so much saying, oh, this is exactly the level of transparency that a state should have, because that's not my field of expertise. That there are other NGOs that are, doing a great job at researching that. So what I do is now, particularly, one thing that I do really believe in is fisheries transparency. And when we say fisheries transparency, at least when I say it, I think that having that public availability of information is crucial, but I don't necessarily think that we should encourage states to just put any fisheries data out there. I think
True.
we need to really emphasize and consider, okay, what type of fisheries data is valuable. So what are NGOs interested in? So look at all these fisheries data elements. Which ones do the NGOs even care about? And which ones can they actually translate into meaningful impact? Like, for instance, that increased capacity. And there are a number of civil society organizations that are really doing a great job. Like I think you have like TNT, you have of course Global Fishing Watch, Oceana is really pushing for that transparency. Pew published a lot of great research. So there are definitely those groups that I really think have an amazingly great focus, and but I don't, and whatever they could use, I think there should be a conversation around, okay, can that type of fisheries data be shared with them? But there's also the other side of the equation, which is concerns about privacy or proprietary information. And that is something that I'm focusing on particularly right now, where it is, and this is very common in international law, where you have maybe an obligation or kind of a goal on the one hand, but on the other hand, you do have rights of individuals, and you need to find a proper balance there. So you can't just, there are certain data elements linked to fisheries that are also linked to individuals, because people work on vessels, people own vessels, people benefit from the vessel activity. So there is a link there between intellectual property law or personal data protection law, the right to privacy. And what I'm doing now specifically is researching, okay, where, I'm currently looking at 30 case studies of different countries, where I'm looking at all of the protections that could possibly exist for fisheries data. So first is looking at, okay, is there any way you can, under this jurisdiction, should certain data elements be protected? And or because it might violate the right to privacy of a person that's on board of the vessel, or it might give away a trade secret because where they're fishing, how they're fishing, etc., is something that's benefiting their company, etc. Where type of protections you find really depends on the jurisdiction, the legal culture, just a lot of different elements there. But basically the first question there is, do these barriers exist? Because a lot of countries sometimes keep the door closed to certain NGOs because they say these barriers exist. And sometimes NGOs don't quite believe that, and they feel they're just unwilling to collaborate with them.
Right.
So my first approach is really just to see, okay, is that assumption of the unwillingness and true? Because if it is true, then okay, then you need to find a way. If that is really the barrier that they see, you need to find a way to work around it.
Yes.
And very often in the law, there are all these exceptions that are foreseen, or things you can do to mitigate the risk around, data being leaked or being made public, etc. So it's definitely not that if you find one challenge somewhere that there's no way to still achieve a higher level of fisheries transparency. But I think we just need to be very diligent about, okay, what data elements are we talking about? Is it valuable? Okay, for these ones where we know it is valuable, what are the legal barriers that may exist? And they don't come from fisheries law. They come from all these other fields of private law that everyone kind of fails to consider, because who knows anything about personal data protection when they work in a Ministry of Fisheries? Like I wouldn't.
So true.
So it makes perfect sense. And okay, if there is that barrier, then you can say, okay, this is how we can kind of work around that, how we can like navigate the law. And then if there's still no response from that state, they're still like, no, we're absolutely not going to work with you, and they're not going to give a good reason why they don't want to increase the transparency, then you have an unwilling state. But until that time, you just don't know. You're making assumptions.
Right.
And I understand that's the role of NGOs sometimes, is to like kick and scream and say what's wrong with the world. But I'd like to bring in a little bit of nuance. I really hope no NGOs take offense at what I just said. But
well, I mean, it's true. Look, let's be honest. When it comes to fisheries, especially if a country is not willing to work with an NGO on a particular item, their job, depending on what NGO it is, a lot of them, their job is either to work with them to be like, hey, let's try and figure out, what the barriers are, just like what you're saying here. But others will get a little bit more aggressive, and they'll press. They'll become more. They'll go from advocation to activism, and they'll say, look, we don't like the way
get to
you're
naming
practicing.
and
Shaming and protesting.
I'm not a fan of those approaches.
And look, I feel like I agree with you. I feel like there's a time and place for it, and sometimes it brings attention. There's always arguments on what type of attention is good attention, is negative or positive, and there's a degree of necessity for some of those organizations to exist and to do what they do. But let's be honest, the collaboration the advancement comes from collaboration. The advancement comes from a little empathy going in. It's like, totally understand where you're coming from. You've had this problem in the past. You really have to get to know the state to just be like, where are you coming from? Why are you progressing this way? We would love to offer you some help if needed, if you would like it. Not every state is going to accept it. Some are, some aren't. I feel like these days, though, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because you probably work with a lot of these different states, do you find most of them are coming in with a little bit more optimism in terms of working with other companies or organizations to better their fisheries?
I think a lot of states, particularly when they have challenges with capacity, they can be very willing. And at least the people you talk to, it's a question sometimes whether the broader political system is as willing, because they have different priorities. But
of course,
it's certainly. And now I just gave the example of working with NGOs, right? And I'm not saying that states are obligated to work with NGOs. I'm just saying there are a lot of NGOs that are doing great work when it comes to fisheries transparency. And if there is a need for more capacity, if there's a need for that support, I think it's a really great option, and it would be a waste basically to have these just because you don't quite know how to work with balancing these different areas of law and these different interests to not move forward with that. I just think that would be a waste. So that's but I'm not saying they're obligated to do that. They're just obligated to have a adequate system for managing their fishery resources. And if they already do that, great.
Yeah.
But I very now feel like, so these are the states, the NGOs that are focusing on working with states, and I think that's great. And I see that the large majority of NGOs in the sector are not even doing that. They're not focused at all on states. They're more like, oh yeah, fisheries management's not really doing the job it should do. So let's just come up with all these private mechanisms that's going to kind of fill that gap. And it just doesn't, because a private institute, you know, sure they can, there are examples of them doing a good job. But ultimately, I feel like it's such a large group focusing only on private efforts, not at all on the role of public institutions. That gives me kind of the impression that we're very distracted with what really matters, which is a more sustainable as in long-term change of how we manage fisheries to really create a more responsible and equitable sector. So that worries me. And I think it's, you know, private mechanisms, they're not able to do the same things that states can. They don't participate in RFMOs. They don't, they don't have they're not involved with the creation of new treaties, like you have now the high seas treaties that where we're waiting to have enough states ratify that. Like, why aren't more NGOs pushing states to ratify this treaty? Like, there is an instrument that can really provide support in this international collaboration that we need. And no, instead we're here just, you know, working with all these different mechanisms that are just tackling such a small part of the issue. And I feel like a lot of time and energy goes wasted there. And that is why, you know, I say generally I'm not necessarily the one that feels particularly comfortable with passing judgment on, you know, states not doing a good job here, well, because I understand the very complex system that they're part of.
Of course.
But when it comes to an NGO, you know, maybe it is because I have worked for an NGO in the past and I know this sector well. I do feel a bit more comfortable being like, no, I've been here now for 8 years and I think you're wrong. I think this approach is just, it's a bandage. Sure, it might do something, but let's not lose track of what really matters here. And that's what states are doing. And I really, really am such a big supporter of the NGOs that are really supporting states directly, or that are pushing states directly, or that are maybe taking part in these types of meetings. Like you have the UN Ocean Conference, or you have sometimes NGOs also have a seat with RFMOs, at least in an advisory capacity. Like all of that, amazing. Keep doing great work there. But ultimately, it should be focused on that primary responsibility. And that lies with states. And they just have so much more power, so much more means to achieve that. And we need to kind of stop putting band-aids everywhere, because we're just creating a lot of confusion and maybe also unwillingness to even talk about sustainability anymore.
Yeah, it's true. No, I agree. It tends to not be the focus anymore. There seem to be more short-term bandages and short-term changes, but nothing long-term. When it comes to the work that you do at Natural Justice, can you talk a little bit about that? You talked about doing research and looking at policies, looking at laws. Can you maybe give us as an example of some of the projects that you're able to talk about?
Yeah, certainly. So I do different projects. It kind of depends. On one side, I do work with these different NGOs, or they're not even really NGOs. They're more like civil society organizations, because they're not in the field of advocacy. But the different civil society organizations that are working on fisheries transparency. And I do legal research on the examples that I gave of personal data protection, for instance, or intellectual property law, where they're running into legal barriers and they're just trying to understand, okay, is this indeed what these government representatives have told us? And if so, how can we change our approach to still be able to work with them, to still achieve our mission, which I fully applaud. I think that's a great way of trying to achieve it, where it's like, okay, if not this way, then this way, because no one said it was going to be easy, right? It's okay to hit these different roadblocks. And
and sometimes the lawmakers don't know the law. Sometimes they don't know the policies that are there. We've kind of seen it here in North America with the new U.S. president or the returning U.S. president talking about certain things like, I can do this, I can do that. But then when it comes down to the court, you can't do a lot of those policies and laws because you just weren't aware of what was happening before.
It's very true.
Yeah.
Often people can work at a government but don't understand the law at all. But even lawyers, they will be so specialized in their field that they don't understand how their field interacts with other fields.
True. Especially when you talk about broadening the type of laws that are coming in for privacy and so forth, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I never focused on personal data protection necessarily that much in law school. I'm lucky that I am from a European law, like that's I was educated in a European law school, and that personal data protection is very much something where the EU has pushed a lot for that, and it's
they take it seriously.
So you see a lot of the different countries, particularly civil law countries. So those are countries that have a legal system based off of the French system, where everything will be very much already dictated in the law, and then the courts role is to interpret that law. That is generally, you see a lot of those countries have personal data protection laws that are very similar to what the EU has done, because I guess they're kind of the leading, I guess, a lot of the development there. But if you look at countries like the US or Canada, where it's a common law system, it will be very different, and also the legal barriers you're going to run into there are going to be very different. So that is a bit novel to me, but I talk to a lot of lawyers from different areas and a lot of stakeholders that are more on the other side, that are running into these legal barriers. And with all of that, I'm trying to kind of make some sort of sense of it. But it's definitely uncharted territory sometimes, because people that are interested in fisheries, they're not going to specialize in personal data protection law. No. I'm lucky because I just love law. It's just one big puzzle to me. I can look at it all day. I'm just like analyzing stuff. I'm just born to do legal work, basically. I also know it sounds extremely boring to a lot of people. And if you're like, I'm going to go into the fisheries sector, marine conservation, it's exciting, you're not going to want to specialize in those areas. And so I don't expect people that work for a Ministry of Fisheries to know a lot about that, because they might think it's not that relevant. But it is. A lot of different legal protections will be relevant for fisheries, because we're talking about fisheries data, and data is such a topic right now, where we're talking a lot about how do we balance the availability of data with privacy and national security,
for sure,
and all these different elements. So it's really quite important, but it is also extremely niche. And government representatives and even lawyers, they won't always know everything. I definitely don't pretend like I know everything. I just know that I'm focused on it, and every day I try and learn a little bit more about it, and every day I try and solve this puzzle a little bit more for the civil society organizations that are trying to work with states on fisheries transparency. I also work on aquaculture. Okay. And there we're looking also a lot at not just the law and policy, but also a lot at the science, and basically just kind of bringing all of that together. And what I really like is generally with natural justice is to bring more, I guess, nuance, and also just more very clear and transparent thinking of, okay, why are we, we're doing a gap analysis. Okay, what's this framework? What have we based that on? And it's just going to be purely based on science, law, very tangible things that are not that political. and just comparing it with the conclusions. It's really up to the clients that we work with to do with that what they see fit. But really just bringing in very thorough analysis. And because we are not a civil society organization, as in that we're trying to make an impact, but we're not a not-for-profit. So we don't depend on funding. We can work on what we want. Well, of course, we need to have clients that actually pay us. Otherwise, I'm doing a lot of volunteering. But we're pretty free in that sense, at least. Yeah, and I think that's great.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's great because it allows you to, get that creativity. It allows you to really expand and also take from, one state and apply what would benefit to another state, or, vice versa. And I think that gives you that freedom to do that, instead of you work for one state or you work for an NGO within the confines of one place. You can really go across sectors within fisheries and across states, which I think is really important. It's what needed, and I think it allows you to build that experience to focus on that, which I think is wonderful.
I'm really grateful as well for having been able to build a good network where I see there's different worlds that I'm sometimes in. They don't interact that much with each other, but I try and interact with all of them. So this research actually that I was talking about, the legal barriers or legal protections of fisheries data, initiated that as a PhD at University of Hamburg. So through that, I'm also part of this like legal scholar community that's just like talks about law of the sea and all those things. And that's just a completely separate world. And then my work world is mostly in the seafood sector, where I am in contact with a lot of civil society organizations, but also with supply chain companies.
Mm-hmm.
And but I also, and this is mostly through I think coursework, and then coursework that I was able to do through FAO, and then now linking that to my research as well, I talked to a lot of government representatives. So I'm really able to learn from the experience of a lot of different people with very different perspectives on this. And it's, I think, really helpful to, would love it if natural justice, like maybe 5 years from now, I can say like, actually, we've helped to kind of build bridges a little bit between those worlds, like bring more of that understanding of the legal perspective into the seafood sector, as well as, to government representatives, where I've taken the example of legal barriers to working with NGOs, but it can even be, there's many examples of legal barriers of different public institutes of one state not being able to share certain fisheries data between them because it was confidential and that couldn't be shared to another institute. So, it really just is relevant for different levels, and with that for different stakeholders. And I really love kind of building those bridges, but also just feel very fortunate that I can learn from a lot of these firsthand experiences, because I certainly don't have them.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love it. This has been amazing to dive deep into, all these different types of policies and laws and where we're at and where we need to go, and the research that you've been able to accomplish. It seems like you're just scratching the surface, from your career and really getting into it. And I love it. And I'd love to have you back on, invite you back on to talk more and on a more regular basis, because I feel like you could become our correspondent for law and fisheries. I think it would be a lot of fun. One last question in terms of like the future of fisheries and law, like where do you think we really need to focus in to really, protect our fisheries overall? It doesn't have to be specifics, but just overall that you've seen in terms of trends of the work that you've been able to do.
Oh, that's a very
it's a big
challenging question. But I think for me right now, with what I've seen, for me, the biggest point is, because governments, they're, like I said, I've emphasized a lot, they're responsible, but they're also in a system that it's not necessarily that they can change things overnight, right? And I recognize that in the interim, we do need the private sector to step up and make sure that they're still sourcing seafood properly. And they rely on NGOs to do that. And that is all fine. But I would still like to really see that instead of fighting each other on which private mechanism is best, there would be maybe a little bit more alignment within that fishery sector. And with that, more focus on pushing states to at least, for instance, ratify these international treaties. Like I've mentioned the High Sea Treaty, but there's also one from the World Trade Organization on the ill-directed subsidies that we see a lot with fisheries. So if we can get more of a push to, at least at the international level, push states to do the right thing, and then we can take that next step on focusing how we can best, as a sector, really push them to responsibly manage those fisheries resources. And I think that could be a much better use of resources.
Yeah.
And I think I'm gonna stop there because I can ramble. I have a lot to say in this context,
love it.
I think I think that could be a good start. And I also know that, looking at least where Europe or the US is now, it's maybe not a very popular opinion to promote state responsibility and environmental management, because we don't really seem to have the politicians in place that are going to step up to do that. But let's not, most cases it's a term of 4 years. Let's not focus on the short-term goals. Let's focus on the long-term goals. And the world's a big place. There's a lot of governments that are still trying every day to do better. And have
it's like we said before, this is not a
fisheries.
And like we said before, it's not sorry, go ahead. You finish.
No worries.
Sorry.
No, just work towards a more promising future of fisheries, because I've seen in the past 8 years a lot of talk, but except for those 2 treaties that I mentioned that need to be ratified by more states, I've seen little tangible results. Yeah.
No, 100%. And then obviously we need more. I don't even think Canada has ratified it yet, the High Seas Treaty anyway.
Call your government today.
I agree.
They're going out soon, so
I'm going out to vote provincially, but we got to talk federally too. I completely agree. Look, this is obviously fisheries is a complex issue. It's never easy to solve. This is why it's been such a topic of conversation for a long time. But I feel like, understanding the laws that are around and what needs to be done is really helpful. So I want to thank you so much, Eva, for coming on the podcast and being able to talk to us about this. And again, can't wait to have you back on to talk more.
Yeah, very welcome. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Eva, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to be able to have you on to discuss law and fisheries. I just think that this is such a complicated issue and so complex. It's nice to have somebody on the podcast to be able to help us get through all the layers of different laws and what we need to really focus on in the future. I thought it was really interesting to see your perspectives on, the law and what we need to do and take away some of these private mechanisms and manage more publicly and more through governance from the different states. I think that's really great. Obviously, collaboration is key, especially within the EU and other countries as well that have, neighboring borders or that share the same border. I feel like that's something that can always be improved upon no matter where you are in the world. So sometimes you are neighbors with friends and sometimes you are not allies. And sometimes you're allies and you don't even realize that one person wants more than the other. And this really can be complex just within that. So it really is a focus on how to negotiate, how to get along, and how to manage fisheries, because fish don't see borders like we do. And so they see borders from natural borders, we see borders from political borders, and that can be complex within itself. So it was great to be able to have Eva on, and I'm going to put links to connect with Eva and find out more about her consultancy called Natural Justice, and you can find her at naturaljustice.nl, www.naturaljustice.nl. And we'll put more links to her LinkedIn as well and to her newsletter. That's it for today's episode. I want to thank Eva again for coming on the podcast. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast. If you have any questions or comments about the episode, please feel free to DM me on Instagram. You can do so at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. And if you are interested in learning more and want to know more about these videos that you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss any of the episodes that we post Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And also, don't forget, you can hit us up on Spotify. You can get us on your favorite podcast app like Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, and so forth. We're on all of your favorite podcast apps. So feel free to join us there, subscribe to that, or follow depending on what they ask you to do so you don't miss any other episode. But that's it for today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin from the True North Strong and Free. Enjoy your day. Have a great one, and happy conservation.